All right, I'm Todd Honeycutt with Mathematica Policy Research. This is research I've conducted with my colleague Frank Martin. One of these days I'm going to learn how to make better titles, because this one's awful. I don't even want to say it, it's so bad. You know, which kids work, implications for WEO is what I should have titled this. So,
Sup youth.
What?
What's up youth?
What's up youth? Oh, but I'm not that clever when I'm putting this together. So essentially I'm going to be talking about kids with disabilities, what happens to them in terms of their VR outcomes and their SSA outcomes after they apply. I want to pay special attention to individual characteristics, but two individual characteristics specifically: their education status, or their educational enrollment at application, or educational status, educational attainment, and employment status at application. Understanding how youth outcomes differ according to those characteristics. And I think what we'll find is probably not too surprising, and probably it's more like what Paul termed admiring the problem this morning. The finding that kids with high school diplomas and they're working, when they apply for VR services, they tend to have better outcomes almost consistently across the board. High school dropouts, those kids who aren't enrolled in school, they don't have a high school diploma, they're not working at the time they apply, those kids have the worst outcomes typically. And high school enrollees, those kids who are enrolled in high school at the time they apply, they're somewhere in between in terms of their outcomes. So that's a preview. This is research funded by Neidler through the VR Practices and Youth Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. Tran leads this effort. Mathematica is a partner along with the Institute for Community Inclusion and the University of Maryland. The center conducts research and technical assistance to improve VR service delivery to youth and their families to help improve outcomes. And the findings and conclusions are just those of the authors. So, VR agencies are in a position where you're having to decide how to implement WEO, and it's an interesting time. It's interesting for me because I'm not part of a VR agency. I don't have to make these decisions, right? I just get to observe it. And from my perspective, it's interesting opportunities for kids with disabilities because it provides potentially a lot more services to these kids. But you know what WEO requires. We're all familiar with, probably more familiar with these issues than me. Requires agencies to focus more resources on youth. 15% of funding is intended to deliver pre-employment transition services to students with disabilities, so kids in high school. Targets both in-school and out-of-school youth. Out-of-school youth, a lot of them are at risk. To improve workplace skills for kids with disabilities. But there's also components to provide supported employment opportunities and to work more with employers as an aspect of WEOA. Another interesting piece is that WEO is going to require agencies to track new outcomes, employment and earnings after program exit, 2 and 4 quarters after a program exit, and to examine skill and credential gain. And these are going to be nice opportunities for agencies to track how effective their services and their programs are. Can somebody close the back door, please? So I want to talk through go through a couple of slides that present some preliminary work we've done as part of the RRTC. And one of these was we wanted to understand what kinds of programs and how many programs agencies offered that are specifically targeted to youth with disabilities. And there's no good source for this. We chose the 2015 VR state plans, which probably are not ideal for this topic, but it's interesting, right? So just through the review of VR state plans, and we just looked at general and combined agencies, not blind agencies, we identified 186 programs that were specifically targeted to youth with disabilities. So that's about, on average, 3 per state agency. It ranged anywhere from 0 for a few states, no mentions, to 7, 8, 9 for a small number of states. And in the descriptions of these programs, 2/3 of them emphasized employment. Other programs emphasized connecting youth with post-secondary education opportunities or keeping in school and attaining a high school diploma. The other thing that's interesting about the state plans is that there was very little mention of using data to understand program effectiveness. So only about 10% of agencies, not 10% of programs, but 10% of agencies mentioned some kind of evaluation activities around these programs. this isn't an ideal situation. I'm sure that states don't list all of their programs in their state plans, but it does give us a sense that there's a lot going on, even with this somewhat flawed activity. This idea that little evidence is being used to evaluate VR youth program effectiveness is also confirmed when we did a literature review to kind of see what's going on, what's published about what's effective about these programs, which programs are successful or not. I forget the dates that we used, but a recent period up through last year, we reviewed the peer-reviewed literature. We only identified 7 programs that were VR programs specifically, whether VR was the leader or just a part of a coalition or a collaborative. It didn't matter from our perspective. 13 articles. And these articles, these programs, there's not a lot of firm evidence about their efficacy. A lot of these were just descriptions of the programs and limited measurement of, or limited use of a comparison group. Some were doing some randomized control studies to see what their effectiveness was, but they hadn't completed that research yet. So little rigorous evidence. Some common themes across these programs were that they generally targeted a specific youth population. It wasn't statewide, it wasn't all youth, it may have been a specific group of youth with disabilities or a specific area. And they typically involved multiple agency partners. And I think that's important because this is difficult work. It's difficult to work with kids. VR can't do it alone. You have to have schools, you have to have other community agencies involved. So given this backdrop, we've got WIOA changes, which are on everybody's mind. There's a lot of programs that are specifically targeted to youth with disabilities. We don't have a lot of evidence on the program or service efficacy with regards with the VR perspective. I wanted to work on filling another gap, or a gap that I perceive in the literature. And maybe it's not a gap. Maybe I just don't know where the literature is in this. But I was curious about the long-term employment and program outcomes for transition age VR customers, because I keep looking and I can't find good information about what happens to kids in the short term or the long term, and to understand how individual characteristics and agency characteristics can affect or influence these types of outcomes. So we examined variation in outcomes across initial educational attainment and employment status, and I think that's important because of WIOA, because WIOA targets youth who are in high school and specific groups of youth outside of high school, as well as other critical individual and agency level characteristics. And hopefully these findings can be used to help agencies with WIOA implementation. So for this research, we used linked RSA and SSA administrative data. We looked at RSA 911 data from 2004 to 2013. And we, from those are closure records, so each fiscal year is a closure record, or everybody who closed in a given year. We identified all youth ages 14 to 24 who applied in 2004 through 2007. So what we wanted to do was to find applicant cohorts and track how they progress through the system and track their long-term outcomes. And the reason why we reorient the data like this is because we're interested in groups of youth who apply in a similar environment. So it's a similar agency environment, it's a similar economic environment at the time that they apply. If we were using just exit records or closure records, so say we take the 2014 closures and examine that, then we have youth who applied in 2014 but didn't get services. They were unsuccessful closures, or they closed, they weren't eligible, they dropped out before services. You have people who applied in 2001, and just it took them a long time to get through the VR program. So they applied at different environments. This way we can somewhat have a uniform background for when they apply. The downside is we have to look further back if we're going to track people going forward. So by using 2004 to 2007, we can look at multiple years of outcomes or multiple years of data. But it's older data. It's older, in terms of VR services. We match these data to the Social Security Administration's disability analysis file, and that's something that Mathematica does through a contract with SSA. And with that information, we can identify one, who is an SSI or SSDI beneficiary. SSI is Supplemental Security Income, SSDI, Social Security Disability Insurance. So we can firmly identify which youth have those benefits. We can track after VR application which non-beneficiaries eventually get onto benefits. We can also track for beneficiaries their likelihood of getting, or not their likelihood, but their actual whether they have any evidence of earnings that affect their benefits outcomes or their monthly benefits. We had certain exclusions. We did not include blind agencies in this analysis. We're going to create a separate issue paper that focuses solely on what happens with youth who apply to blind agencies. We excluded youth who died as a reason for closure. U.S. territories dropped RSA records that didn't match to the DAF, and we only included youth who were eligible for services, so those who were found ineligible. We dropped them from the analysis. So by using these two data sources and looking at 4 years of closure data, oh, the other caveat too is that for youth who applied during this period, 2004 to 2007, but were still in services as of 2013, we don't have those, the experiences of those individuals, and they may be very different than youth who close early on. The analysis or the data approach resulted in 600,000 or almost 600,000 youth for our analysis. Any questions about the analytical techniques, or at least for the data? Okay. So I'm going to walk through some descriptive presentations of the outcomes we're interested in and then get into more of the analyses. So for VR outcomes, we're interested in 3 VR outcomes from the VR status. One is exited before IPE, so these are essentially failed, not failed, that's the wrong word, VR dropouts. They are eligible for services, but they leave before obtaining a plan for employment. That's a little less than a third. The second group exited after IPE with employment, so these are individuals who received services, but they weren't employed at exit. These are unsuccessful closures. And then the final group, and that's around a third as well, or 30%. And then the last group exited after IPE, but with employment. So they received services, exited with employment. These are successful closures, and about 38% of youth were successful closures. And that's out of the full sample. Here are our SSA outcomes. And one thing I want to point out is that whereas in the previous slide, we were looking at all youth, all 580 some odd thousand youth. Here, the ends differ for each of these outcomes because they have different denominators. So the first outcome is SSI benefits received within 60 months of those without SSI at application. So if you didn't have SSI at application, we tracked whether you received SSI at any point within 60 months after your application to VR. This also includes the DI beneficiaries, because there's a chance that DI beneficiaries would get SSI after. Not a big chance, but there's a chance. So that was 449,000, 450,000 youth who we followed, and that was less than 10% of youth received SSI. SSDI benefits received within 60 months, so of those without SSDI at application, what proportion actually go on to receive SSDI? The end there is about 540,000, and again, is a little bit less. It's around 6-7% who go on to receive DI benefits. Then we have 2 measures for those who receive SSI or DI benefits at application. And the term we use is benefits foregone due to work. So there's evidence that their benefits were reduced because of earnings at some point within 60 months. This isn't a measure of amount of earnings foregone. It's just a binary measure of any. And for SSI beneficiaries, that proportion is pretty large. About 45%, 46% of youth will have at least 1 month where they had a loss of earnings, a reduction in their earnings a reduction in their benefits because of earnings. The proportion for SSDI is a lot less. It's around 12%. But I still want to emphasize that this 12%, that's a big number, right? Because SSI is a means-tested program. You have earnings in a month that exceed a certain threshold. After certain deductions, your SSI benefits are docked almost immediately. DI, that's not the case. DI, you have to have a substantial level of earnings at around SGA. I forget what SGA is. I should know this. Over $1,000. What?
It's 1,130.
Okay, thank you. So it's good to have somebody in the audience knowing some of those details. Not often do I get that. So, but then you have to go through a trial work period, and then you get your benefits suspended due to work. So this is a pretty high bar, and it occurs within 60 months, within 5 years of applications. That's a pretty significant number. It's a small end, right? 42,000, 43,000. But so those are the outcomes in which we're interested. Sure.
How did you handle if they went, like they had multiple episodes of VR within that 5 months?
Oh,
Did you handle that?
we take the first episode of VR. So and then we don't worry about the second or third episode. So there's some fuzziness there, right? So
It's hard, you know.
yeah, I mean that's hard to model different episodes. I think that's worth its own paper. There's also, you know, we also don't just full disclosure, you know, we're looking here at any benefits foregone if they had SSI at application. But what happens for these kids who get SSI after application? I'm not paying attention to that group. So that could be another. So it's just cleaner to explain this way. So here we're getting into individual characteristics, or first set. And I want to explain to you how we develop this education and employment variable. So we use the two variables from the RSA 911 data. Educational attainment at application and employment status at application. And there's some fuzziness here. There's not a school enrollment variable in the RSA 911 data, unfortunately. So I take the combination of those two to identify these 7 groups. So the largest proportion of youth applicants in the sample were those with a high school diploma or more, at least a high school diploma, but who weren't working or in school. So around 29%, I guess, of youth were in this category. That's the largest category. Second largest, just barely, I think that's 27%, are those who were enrolled in high school, right? So the RSA 911 data are funny because to get this enrolled in high school, I'm identifying kids whose reason for employment is that they're enrolled in school. So it's like a stepwise listing, right? So are you employed, yes or no? If you are employed, you get a 1. If you're not employed, what is your reason for not being employed? The first reason is to be in school, either secondary or post-secondary school. If you're not in school, you're not employed and you're not in school, then you get into other categories. So I'm using an employment variable category to identify high school enrollment and enrollment in post-secondary education. That's a little fuzzy, and I'll explain why that's important in a slide or two later. The other group that's fairly large, I think is around 16%, those with no high school diploma and they're not working or in school at application. These are what we think of as high school dropouts. So there's this other group of dropouts, no high school diploma, but they're working or in school at the time of application. That's the group I think is a little sketchy, but we'll talk about that. The group who's working or in post-secondary school, they have a high school diploma, fairly small, less than 10% of each. And then there's a small group, around 2%, for whom I didn't throw out, but they have missing education or employment data, because it's administrative data. Now, one of the things why I think this distinction or this distribution is important is because now we can go and look at, okay, how do state agencies vary in the proportion of youth who are in these categories? So here, we're looking at the percentage of youth applicants in high school, right? So that was the second largest group. These are kids who are enrolled in high school based on the employment and education variables. They don't have a high school diploma, but they're not working because they're employed. The median agency, state agency, around 25% of its youth, so of all youth applicants, 25% were enrolled in high school at the time of application. We show the 10 states with the highest rate, the 10 states with the lowest rate. So you've got Maine and Illinois here. Almost 60% of the kids that come to the door, that apply, are enrolled in high school at that time. And everybody over here on this side has more than 40%. On the low end, you got New Mexico, District of Columbia, Alaska, Ohio. 5% or less of kids are enrolled in high school. Now, one implication, and again, it's a little fuzzy, One implication is that, you know, these agencies may be in a better position for pets, meeting pets' requirements than these agencies, right? Because these agencies are already in the school, right? These agencies are not as present in the school. They you know, may have school connections, likely have school connections, but they're just not, they're waiting to enroll kids after graduation, say, you know, so that could be one difference. These, you know, there's no guarantee that they're working with kids at a earlier point, right? They could be enrolling kids the semester before they graduate, you know. So it bumps this up. They're getting all those kids, you know, 6 months before these folks. I don't know that. One thing we could do is look at the age distribution. You could look at kids who are 14, 16, 17, you know, 14, 15, 16, 17, versus 18, 19, and do a breakdown there. But I do think just overall that this difference is interesting in how agencies are and the kids who are applying to agencies, when agencies are getting these kids. The other thing, I guess, to point out too is that if there are issues with needing to reach other at-risk groups or other populations, these agencies that are focused more on high school kids will have more difficulties than, say, some of the other states. So that would be the converse. Here we're looking at select demographic characteristics across each of the education and employment groups. So here are the variables. Here are all youth in the sample, and then we've got the enrolled in high school group, and I'll just walk through these and point out a couple of things that I thought were interesting, because partly I want to see, like, does this make sense, you know, in terms of who's in each of these groups. For those enrolled in high school, you know, they're mostly male, white, 73%. They tend to be younger, so that's consistent with what you would expect. Nobody over 21, at least in large numbers. Half of these youth have learning or cognitive disabilities, which fits our expectations for who's enrolled in special education, who has an IEP. About 22% have SSA benefits at application. One interesting thing about this column is that it looks just like this column. This column here is no high school diploma, working, or in school. So recall that that employment status variable where I'm getting school enrollment, if you're employed and in school, you're probably going to be classified as employed. So this group, I think that this group is actually a group of high school enrollees. They're just working at the time that they apply, and they're in high school, because this distribution is almost exactly the same. The high school dropout group, those who don't have a diploma, not working, or in school, the interesting thing about this column is how many other risk factors they seem to have. They're a hard to serve population. There are a lot of barriers to a lot of things for them. There's a higher proportion of them who are non-white. Age is about what you would expect. Large portion who have mental health issues, 23%, you know, versus 10% in the high school group. And a large portion, not the largest, but a large proportion who have SSA benefits at the time that they apply. So several factors that make them not the best candidates. The three high school groups, question?
Sorry, no, I'm sorry, I'm responding. That's really huge, because that's a group that it will not be counted in PEPs.
Right, because they're not in high school.
Yeah, they dropped out, or...
But they are an at-risk group. I mean, it's, you know, so the high school diploma group, or, you know, whether they're working in school or not working or in school, they have characteristics that you might expect, differ from the other groups. One interesting thing that jumped out at me was the other physical disability. By the way, there are some other impairments. This doesn't total to 0. There are some other impairments that I didn't exclude because these are enough numbers and rows. A larger proportion of them have other physical disabilities, right? 16, 14, 15, you know, compared to 7, 9, 9. So the physical disability group, those folks are going to be excluded from the enrolled in high school experience. A lot of those kids are not, they may not have IEPs because their disability doesn't interfere with their school functioning. It does interfere with work functioning. So that's another thing to think about with that group. Any questions? Anything I'm not clear about?
I'm going from vague memory, so that's always a problem, but just a percentage in high school working with VR, It strikes me, because that old kind of youth transition project, and there were states, you know, the old YTP stuff, and it looked like some of the states which were included in it, which you'd think would be higher, were low, like Oregon and Maryland, so I don't know if that's an anomaly with the, I'm surprised
yeah,
that
I mean,
those states were low in terms of considering they were.
yeah, and I don't really know how to, it's dependent on how good the education and enrollment values are in the RSA 911 data. So are they classified as I'm thinking about them? And I think that's a good question. I don't know. You know, it could be that they're just grabbing kids right after they graduate from school, but I don't know enough about those programs.
Yeah, no, it's just I mean, just from a system change, you know, that's what from research, and that there are two states that pride themselves in the transition program. You know, if you ask them about VR, that's one of the things they highlight is their transition programs, and yet a failure. Which in theory would be people while they're still in high school. You know?
Yeah. The other thing I want to point out is that these are 2004, 2005, 2006 data. These are older data, right? 2004 through 2007. Experiences now may be different. I mean, I could look at the more recent data and do the same analysis on who, roughly, you know, on who closes in their status at application, and see if they're highly similar with the two methods.
Yeah, because these are their numbers. This data is from when they applied, not when they closed.
These data are from when they apply.
When they applied.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're looking at predicting outcomes. In the first outcome is who's likely to receive services. So you have the group of VR dropouts compared to those who receive services. We're predicting who receive services relative to those who drop out before an IPE out of all eligible. Here we present odds ratios. Odds ratios, if you have an odds ratio of greater than 1, you have higher odds of the outcome. A ratio that's lower than 1, significantly lower than 1, means you have lower odds, or you're less likely to have odds of the outcome. Here we're looking at, and the model controls for individual characteristics and agency characteristics. So these are adjusted for those things. So just to walk you through it, it's also, all of these groups are relative to high school enrollees. So compared to high school enrollees, high school dropouts, those without a diploma, they're not working or in school, they're 74% as likely to get to services. They're dropping out before they get a plan, even though they're eligible. Same thing with, but not as large, for those with a high school diploma and they're working, or high school diploma not working. They're 95 and 94% as likely. It's significant, but it's not as big a difference as with this group. Those with who have a high school diploma and they're working, or they're in secondary school, post-secondary school, have slightly higher odds of getting a plan and getting services. When we look at some of the individual characteristics for the same outcome, whether you get services or not, the striking things here are that blacks relative to whites are less likely. Again, this is, you know, from Paul saying it's not a unique finding by any means, but it's just more confirmatory. Blacks relative to whites less likely to get to services. Kids with SSI-only benefits relative to non-beneficiaries are less likely to get services. Females are a little bit more likely compared to males, as are those who are older, but age is a little different here, a little weird here. And there's no difference between those with SSDI-only benefits and those who are non-beneficiaries in terms of getting to services. This, by the way, is an interesting finding, at least from SSA's perspective, because their assumption is that, you know, everybody with SSA benefits is eligible for services. I mean, that's part of the package of services and benefits that they give. And it's a mystery as to why so many drop out. I found it in other studies. I find it here, but they're found eligible at a higher rate, but they just don't get to services.
The age group that's going into redetermination with teen families sometimes get nervous around 17 and 18 and
Yeah, they do.
services. So you've got that redetermined age group. It'd be interesting to see if you can narrow it. Kids 14 to 16, 16 to 18.
Yeah.
You know, somehow there's a way to look at that.
Yeah, so my research is a little bit muddied in that, and I think that's worthy of its own paper. Like, what happens with kids younger than 18, right? The other thing is, though, that if you're in VR, you get a waiver. even though you're so the issue is that for SSI, for youth who are less than age 18, they get SSA benefits or SSI benefits because of a youth determination, a youth version of disability definition. At age 18, they have to undergo an age 18 redetermination in which their disability, their situation is evaluated on adult outcomes. And a lot of kids, they don't make it through. They get found not eligible for SSI benefits as an adult. So for families, their concern is that they may not want to be showing their kid as able to work, before that determination period. If a youth is receiving VR services, they get I forget what the waiver is called. Do you know what the waiver is? The Section 508, 503, something like that waiver. So if they're in a VR program, they're getting services, even though they may get a negative determination as an adult, they continue receiving SSI benefits. So there's a real fuzzy area, so I guess my response there is that these kids should, they may be better off receiving services because they would get the SSI benefits longer if they were found to have a negative redetermination. The question is, would they get a negative redetermination because they're in VR and being successful? I think that's the concern.
I think another interesting thing to look at that area would be minority versus non-minority. It's very hard to get people who are in non-minority receiving SSI in VR system. Very difficult to engage them.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And for those listening, the point is that for the SSI only group, understanding differences in the experiences of white and non-white would be important to disentangle. And also I want to give another caveat to all of this. I've got 583,000 youth, and I'm looking at somewhat at individual characteristics, but I think one of the things that concerns me is that these 583, even though I'm looking at different characteristics, these are very different kids in terms of disability status, in terms of race and ethnicity status, and their outcomes may be different, and I think it's worth additional analytical considerations to kind of break things down a little bit more than what I'm doing here, which is just really a first cut. The experiences for youth with autism or youth who are black may be very different when we do these same cuts. That's something that's increasingly on my mind. So.
If I could put a plug in for looking at kids with behavioral health issues, the reason is the way pre-employment training services is going in WIOA. The kids who are the high school dropouts, who are in that 16 age area that maybe who are possibly on SSI, possibly not, but who have behavioral issues might get caught up in other systems like corrections, and that's the exact group that pre-employment training services is not really focusing on.
Yeah.
And that's a morally repugnant situation, in my humble opinion, that those kids that are the most in trouble may be not being counted under pre-employment training services.
Right, and this idea of the intersection between youth with disabilities and, well, an interesting point is that youth with disabilities who get involved in the juvenile justice system aren't likely to get to VR, right? So I've been working with juvenile justice areas a little bit, and when I ask them about VR, they're like, who? What? Or, yeah, I sent a kid there. It took him a year to get the services, so I don't send anybody else there. I think that's a really interesting
the one
issue.
factor is that on the other side, 75% of the WIOA youth money has to be on out-of-school youth. There's a little bit of the disconnect in that it's disconnected from VR, yet a lot of the WIOA youth money is supposed to be targeted now out of school.
Like I said, it's interesting. It's interesting. I'm glad I'm not in a VR agency. I'm glad I'm not in a VR agency. I'm on the outside looking at those issues.
I think what you said, the juvenile justice, in
Yeah.
general, we do it with behavioral problem because most VR agencies have orientations, and it's 2 o'clock on Wednesday, and the kid shows up at 10 a.m. on Thursday, and VR says you're not ready. We'll come back in 3 weeks, and the kid says enough of this.
Let's turn now to another VR outcome. This is the typical VR outcome. Do you exit with employment relative to not exiting with employment after receiving services? Again, we're looking at odds ratios. These are the education and employment groups. So again, you see that high school dropouts, even if they get services, they're 78% as likely to exit with employment relative to high school enrollees. The other group's fairly similar. It won't surprise you that the group with the highest odds of exiting with employment, those who are working when they began, so I don't think there's anything groundbreaking here in terms of the distribution. It is interesting, I guess, to me that those with a high school diploma and post-secondary education, they were no more or less likely to exit with employment than high school enrollees. When we look at the same outcome, exiting with employment, by the individual, select individual characteristics, females less likely than males to exit with employment, which is consistent. Blacks less likely have lower odds than whites. SSDI and SSI, those folks are almost half as likely to exit with employment. Flipping it around, they're more than twice as likely to not exit with employment, to be unsuccessful closures. Again, that's consistent. Older age youth are a little bit more likely to exit with employment than kids who are 14 to 18. So this slide's a little bit busier. We're looking at, of those youth without SSI or youth without SSDI benefits, what's their likelihood of obtaining SSI or SSDI benefits within 60 months when relative to high school enrollees. And there's some interesting patterns here, or at least I think are interesting. High school dropouts no more or less likely to have either outcome relative to those who are enrolled in high school. So it's about the same. When you look at those individuals who are working, whether they have a high school diploma or not, they're more likely to receive DI and less likely to receive SSI benefits. So that makes sense to me because these are individuals who are accumulating credits. They're paying into the OASDI, the Old Age Disability Survivors System. So the disability criteria for SSI and DI are the same. It's just a means test or an assets test versus whether you've paid into our national insurance system. So these folks have paid into it, and they're more likely to get DI, less likely to get SSI. And same kind of thing for those with a high school diploma not working or in school, which I would have actually expected to be a little bit opposite. I would have expected this group to have a little bit higher odds of SSI and lower odds of DI. One of the interesting things, though, I think the most interesting thing about this slide is you look at those youth who were enrolled in post-secondary school when they applied, they're less likely to get both outcomes, DI or SSI. So even though in the previous slide we found that that group was no more or less likely to exit with employment, or maybe a little bit less, I can't remember, they're actually less likely to get on to DI or SSI benefits. I mean, the conventional wisdom is that kids in post-secondary school just are going to have better outcomes, they're going to have better careers, and this might support that. Could also be a function of, if we look at 10 years, they may be just as likely as high school enrollees. This is a smaller period, they still may be in school or just out of school. Don't look at individual characteristics here. I'm switching to a different outcome. These are the benefits foregone due to work, BFW, so any evidence that for individuals with SSI or DI benefits that they've had any of their benefits lost because of earnings. And I think the interesting thing here is that, there's no surprise that those who were working when they applied, whether they had a high school diploma or not, were more likely to have benefits foregone for either benefit. For those in post-secondary school, they were slightly more likely to have SSI benefits foregone, but their odds of having DI benefits foregone were almost as high as those who were working when they applied. Again, that suggests that those who are getting, building their human capital, having better educational attainment potentially, that they're in a better position to get off DI. And I think that's something that's worth further investigation, especially from SSA's perspective. Generally across the board, almost all these groups relative to those who were enrolled in high school were more likely to have benefits foregone with the exception of high school dropouts.
Foregone means they gave it up or they never applied.
Foregone means that they didn't forego it, they didn't choose that, but they had earnings sufficient to result in a reduction in their monthly benefit. For SSI, it'd be month to month because it's mean tested. There are people on it, yep. For DI, they have to go through that whole process. So you made it through all the number and figure slides. The final set of findings I want to talk about is that the agency characteristics. Again, this is a correlational study. It's not causal. We're just looking at the general association of patterns. The odds of a youth I'll learn how to use this. The odds of a youth receiving services, so it's that first outcome that we looked at, if the agency was not in order of selection, they were more likely to get services, and that makes sense. With the order of selection, you have restricted access. But also, shorter times for services, and that's something that we talked about in an earlier session. It's the idea that when you have shorter application eligibility times, not for the individual, but in aggregate for the agency, because we calculated agency level statistics for each year, for each application year. So on average, let me say it differently. When you have shorter application eligibility times and eligibility to having assigned IPE or plan, time to plan, when those times were shorter, the youth was more likely to get to services. And no matter how many times I run these numbers, and I've done a number of studies on wait times, like I had a friend show me some numbers yesterday, and the average time for everybody, not just kids, for application eligibility is 40 days, was 40 days in the sample that he was talking about. It was 4 or 5 months from eligibility to plan. Like these seem like long times to me. So it's no surprise that shorter times for these variables result in higher odds of a youth receiving services. Now, shorter times didn't have any effect for exiting with employment. It's that initial process, that assessment process where it has its most association. So the odds of exiting with employment were higher when the agency was in order of selection, which is weird to me, but it probably represents the fact that there are fewer people getting into services, so that the counselors there can provide a little bit more attention or resources. And these are two things that are somewhat counterintuitive, and I haven't quite teased out the implications here. One is that an agency, when you look at everybody who applies, adults and youth, when an agency serves a higher proportion, when an agency has a higher proportion of youth applicants among the entire pool, the odds of a youth exiting with employment are higher. So it's this idea of volume. You think about with cardiac care, do you want to go with a doctor who does one patient a year or one who does 200? You want the one with 200. So it may reflect that in the community or the state, there's a higher emphasis on youth, that there's a bigger pipeline for youth from schools to VR agencies. I'm not sure, but there are definitely agencies that have a higher proportion of youth, more than the average of 30%. So, but the contradictory finding is that when among those youth who apply, if the proportion of youth who get services is lower, then your odds of exiting with employment are higher. And again, that may just be a restriction issue. You're concentrating your efforts on a smaller number of youth, but it's not something I've quite teased out yet.
Accepting means fewer who are eligible or fewer who will get services?
Among those who are eligible, fewer get services. So again, there's kind of a constriction in the pipeline. So
it's the kids who might not exit with employment drop out.
the kids who, yeah.
Do they have higher dropout rates? Is that another way of saying it?
These are agencies that have higher dropout rates. If the dropout rate is higher than average, then you're more like those who do get to services are more likely to exit with employment.
So I wonder in one sense that those dropout kids at VR, that's a horrible phrase, those kids that do not get to services in VR are similarly the kids in your earlier data that have all kinds of other barriers going on.
Yeah, that could be. That could be.
You're talking about kids that get lost in multiple systems.
Yeah, that could be. That could be. I don't think that VR dropouts is a bad phrase. I think it's what happens. You got a third.
Dropout seems awful.
Well, so, yeah. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Yeah, exactly. Some sort of dropout they could have gone on and gotten their own job and saw no reason for VR.
Sure.
They could become very ill, or their disability flares up.
Mm-hmm.
Or they could disappear from that, they could move to a different state, they could move to a different location.
Yeah.
They could be incarcerated, they could get pregnant. I mean, there's 100 reasons why.
Is there a reason for closure code of incarceration? Yeah. Okay.
Well, if they disappear, so the VR agency doesn't know what happened to them.
Yeah.
If they do know.
If they do
Huge
know.
chunk of kids.
Yeah.
Gosh. To out Maine, we're
Mhm.
working with Maine on some of this, and the kids with the behavioral health issues, they just fall off the radar. It's hard to find them.
Mm-hmm.
So VR doesn't necessarily
Right.
know how to close
Yeah,
them.
could not
because they
locate.
can't find them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's where if you had state level administrative data matched to, for VR matched to state juvenile justice data, state health data, state school data.
You're coming up with incredibly powerful information on why pre-employment training services needs to include those youth that drop out.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but
It's a big argument right now. It's a huge argument. And I think that you're finding you've got a lot of information that makes a case.
okay. See, what I've struggled with is whether this is interesting or not, because I
Very
don't
interesting.
know.
I'm on board.
Okay. Implications for VR and WIO, I think there's some ones I haven't thought of, but I think some agencies may be better prepared to deliver pets to, already work with a larger proportion of kids who are high school youth. I think one of the interesting things from my perspective is that increasing service provision to either in-school youth or particularly out-of-school youth could have implications for the employment outcomes that an agency has, both with youth and overall. I think if one is if you're serving more youth, providing more resources, that squeezes out the experiences for adults with disabilities, or that there's a constriction of service provision to them. That'll be interesting to track. I think if you increase service provision to high school dropouts who aren't working, I think if you have a big push for that, it's going to decrease your overall outcomes, potentially. But there's also this piece where agencies are supposed to be working more with employers. And if they're working more with employers, then they're catching youth who are working. They're going to have better outcomes. I mean, this is also predicated on, whether it's causal, but it's also predicated on the fact that the environment in which I conducted, which I pulled the data, 2004 to 2007, a little bit after. One, it's clouded a little bit by the Great Recession, which I didn't mention earlier. The other piece is that the service environment for these kids is going to be fundamentally different when they apply today, right? They're going to encounter different programs, different services. They're going to have more pets. They should have more access to work experiences. So, I mean, it's anybody's guess what the actual changes are going to be. For actual service provision, I think for individual counselors, when you're working with high school youth or high school dropouts who aren't working, the struggles are going to be a little bit different, and the outcomes may be potentially different, or the odds of outcomes. That we find that there are agency processes, such as times to employment, that are correlated with serving more youth, and then exiting with employment. This idea of volume in some way affects the outcomes that an agency has. And then this last point here is that somewhat related to the research. So we can identify outcomes for different kinds of youth. We can examine what happens to them. We can look at long-term outcomes. But what specific services and programs these youth have received is a little bit of it's a lot of a black box, at least from my perspective. When I use the RSA 911 data, I know that I can see binary indicators of which types of services they received. I don't know exactly what the quality of those services are, or the quantity of those services. I can look at in aggregate what the cost of purchase services are, but that's going to differ from agency to agency. So what happens in between? How you get youth with better outcomes, I still don't know with the data that I have. And I think there's a couple of things here where agencies to get back to an earlier point, agencies are doing a lot. They have a lot of programs, they have a lot of services, they're targeting youth in different ways. But if they're not analyzing what the outcomes are, what's effective or not, then that doesn't do either them a service, the youth that they're serving a service, or the VR community as a whole. I think there's a lot of rich opportunities for agencies to push a little bit on how they think about looking at outcomes just within their agency and with their own programs. We're actually, Mathematica, as part of this RRTC, we're working with 2 state agencies on their data analytics specifically for youth to understand how they can push what they're already doing in terms of tracking youth, identifying which ones are getting which services, which youth could get the right services, looking at timing, looking at dashboards, and tracking outcomes over a long period of time. And the advantage of improving your data analytics capacity within a state agency is that you're able to then start doing experiments, small controlled experiments, with delivering different services at different points in time and seeing what works best for whom. And I think that's a very exciting opportunity. From their perspective and from my perspective. The other piece is that once you identify what works or what doesn't, what you're doing, I think it's important for agencies to start getting the word out about what it is that they're doing, because I don't think there's much out there at an individual agency level on what's effective and what's going on. So that is my talk on VR and youth. Any questions, thoughts, problems? Happy to hear problems with my research stuff.
Did you come across any instance in which, in the state plans or otherwise, where VR agencies might be getting involved in high school retention efforts?
Some of the programs that I mentioned from the earlier study in Purvey Civic, who's doing that, and that'll be an issue brief that's coming out hopefully in a month or so. Some of those programs were specifically for high school retention. So.
Could be good use of PETS money.
Yeah, could be, yep. Anything else, any thoughts?
Even though statistically significant, your odds ratio actually like the 1.03.
Yeah.
1.98. That's almost 50%, even though statistically significant.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. It's okay.
Right. It's a little bit difficult to. It's really kind of the height.
The height.
And the other way.
Yes.
Opponent.
Yes. The idea is that when you have 580,000 people, you get a lot of p-values of less than 0.05. So it's really what are the actual odds? There's the size of that distribution that you really want to pay attention to. It's 95% really different than 1. Probably not going to hang my hat on that, but 74%,
Right.
being 74% is likely, is pretty sizable. So that's a good point. So.
What's going on with girls?
Well, they're more likely to get services, right?
Yeah.
But I think typically girls don't, they have lower employment rates, just no matter how you cut the data. So, yeah. So what's interesting, I guess, is whether they're more likely to be in post-secondary school, get post-secondary services, and what the outcomes are. Because the trend is what for more girls are going to college than boys. So, all right. Thank you very much. Oh, go ahead.
If you do it like you're doing right now, you're essentially sampling data from 11 years ago. If you do that, won't we not know what we're doing right now? It's been a long day. Let me rephrase it. If you're taking the research and looking at it 10 years from now, how will we know what we're doing now is working to continue, or you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Will we be changing?
Yeah. So there are 2 issues here. One is that you could this study was intended to give us like a pre-WIOA assessment of how things are for kids with disabilities. We can do this study in 10 years and look at the WIOA period, and we can compare pre and post. That's one issue. You can see what the effects of WIOA are. But the other thing I think is really what you're asking is how we know now if what we're doing is going to work. Waiting on RSA 911 data to come out is not going to get it done, right? Because it's dated by the time we get it, by the time it's published, that to do the analysis I'm doing, I need multiple years of data to find that earliest year, right, of applicants to track their experiences. The real impetus has to be for state agencies to do analyses in real time about what they're doing and assessing whether it's working or not. that's where, or researchers working with state agencies and doing this kind of work to say, okay, what's going on? What changes have you made? Does it have an effect? Does it have the effect that we want? Because by the time the RSA 911 data are published, it's not as informative for a state agency in terms of determining what they're doing. And in part, that's because the service and program information is so limited. I mean, there's no program information in the RSA 911 data, it's just services, right? So, but a state agency will have details about, very rich details about the services and about the programs that they're offering. And you know, there's 186 programs at least, but where's the information about the effectiveness? And you know, talking with some VR agency folks, they have it, they're collecting it, but it's in a box, literally in a box on paper, you know, and they're just waiting to do it. And if that person leaves, it'll never get done. So how do we build systems to encourage agencies to use the data that they have to inform the community? I think that's got to change. Good point.
And then think of something else too. With the 186 programs you were talking about, I can't remember the exact statistic you were saying that whatever percentage of them was employment focused, and the other people were post-secondary, getting people that graduate from high school. What would I mean? I'm looking at it from a VR, local rehab counselor standpoint. If someone's going to school to get their diploma, whether it be high school or post-secondary, wouldn't that be at least indirectly in pursuit of employment?
Yes. Yeah. So these programs were explicitly employment focused, like that was something that they mentioned. So, I mean, getting a degree is also, you know, meant to push agencies towards their goals. The other thing I would emphasize too is that, you know, this idea of successful closure versus not successful closure is not necessarily the end all or be all. You know, this idea that with WEO we're going to have different outcomes about skills gain, skills change. I think that's going to be an important outcome to consider, especially for kids. So, because that's a value too, just as valuable as having a job when you exit. So, thank you very much for your time.